The moment the words left his mouth, the restaurant fell silent. Leo, man, what's the deal with you only dating girls half your age? You ever gonna date someone who remembers dial-up internet? The voice that cut through the air belonged to a man who was far too comfortable in his own ignorance. He sat at a table near the bar, leaned back in his chair like he owned the place, his voice dripping with the kind of smug confidence that only came from someone who believed they were untouchable. He wasn't alone. His group of friends, all similarly dressed in expensive streetwear and designer watches, erupted into laughter, some slapping the table, others raising their drinks in mock cheers. They weren't just enjoying the joke, they were feeding off the energy, waiting to see if the room would rally behind them. DiCaprio didn't look up. He sat at his table, the candlelight flickering over the rim of his glass, fingers loosely wrapped around it as if he hadn't even heard the comment. His expression didn't change. No flinch, no irritation. Just the same calm, unreadable focus he had mastered over years of existing under a microscope. The man at the bar wasn't satisfied. He glanced around, emboldened by the silence, his grin widening when he saw a few people at nearby tables watching, their curiosity piqued. He leaned forward, as if performing on a stage, amplifying his voice. Come on, we're all thinking it, right? Man's out here recycling girlfriends like they're lease agreements. Tell me, Leo, what happens when they hit 26? You send them a severance package? More laughter from his table. A few scattered chuckles from another, but they died out quickly when it became clear that not everyone was playing along. DiCaprio finally moved. It was subtle. He set his glass down with the kind of deliberate ease that felt too precise to be casual. Then, and only then, did he lift his gaze. His blue eyes locked onto the man with an intensity that wasn't aggressive but wasn't indifferent either. It was the kind of stare that cut through bravado, that forced people to feel the weight of their own words. You done? The man's smirk twitched slightly, but he wasn't backing down yet. Oh, come on, man. It's just a joke. You're a public figure. You can take a joke, right? DiCaprio tilted his head slightly, studying him. You think this is about me? His voice was calm, measured, but there was something underneath it, something that made the laughter at the man's table start to falter. The man blinked, his smirk dimming. This isn't about me, DiCaprio continued, his tone unwavering. It's about you. You wanted attention, so you picked the loudest way to get it. That's fine. But here's the problem. You're the only one laughing now. The shift was instant. The man's friends, who had been so eager to play along just moments ago, suddenly weren't looking at him. One of them cleared his throat and took a long sip of his drink. Another glanced toward the entrance as if considering an early exit. The joke wasn't funny anymore. DiCaprio didn't lean in, didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. He just let the weight of the moment hang there. I could answer you. I could explain my relationships, my life, my choices. But you don't care about any of that. You don't even believe half of what you're saying. You just wanted to see if you could get a reaction, make yourself the main character in a moment that has nothing to do with you. The room was silent. A deep, crushing silence. The influencer swallowed, his smirk now a shadow of itself, and it was clear to everyone in the room that whatever confidence had fueled him before had burned out. He glanced at his friends again, expecting some kind of backup, but they weren't making eye contact. The weight of isolation started settling in. DiCaprio let the silence linger, then picked up his glass again. Before taking a sip, he gave the man one last look. If my dating life is the most interesting thing you have to talk about at dinner, I feel sorry for you. It was a simple statement, but the way it landed, it might as well have been a knockout punch. The influencer flinched, just barely, but enough that those watching closely noticed. His mouth opened slightly, like he wanted to argue, to defend himself, to throw out one last desperate attempt at saving face, but he knew there was nothing left to say. No comeback. No witty response. Just the undeniable truth that he had lost. The energy at his table had completely shifted. His friends weren't laughing anymore. One of the girls at his table, who had been encouraging him just minutes ago, suddenly looked embarrassed to even be associated with him. Another guy from his group, the one wearing too many rings for it to look effortless, pretended to check his phone, avoiding the tension entirely. At a nearby table, a middle-aged man in an expensive suit leaned slightly toward DiCaprio as he passed, murmuring under his breath, "Handled that well." DiCaprio didn't stop walking. "I didn't handle anything," he said, his voice steady. "I just let him handle himself." The man chuckled, shaking his head, but said nothing more. The waiter returned with the bill, setting it down in front of DiCaprio with careful precision. His face was neutral, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of restrained amusement, maybe even quiet approval. All set, sir. Would you like anything else? DiCaprio shook his head, slipping his card from his wallet. I'm good. The waiter took the card and disappeared, leaving behind a restaurant that had returned to normal, at least on the surface. Conversation slowly resumed, forks clinked against plates, and the air filled with the hum of expensive, polite conversation. But here and there, people still exchanged glances, whispering quietly about what had just unfolded. The influencer, still sitting at his table, looked smaller than before. His friends were talking amongst themselves now, avoiding him, eager to move on, to pretend they hadn't just encouraged him moments ago. He exhaled sharply, mumbling something under his breath before pushing back his chair, standing quickly like he wanted to escape the room entirely. His group followed, some more reluctantly than others, and within moments, they were gone. Their table, once filled with laughter, now just an empty reminder of a moment that hadn't gone the way they expected. DiCaprio signed the bill, stood, and walked toward the exit. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The moment had already disappeared from his mind. But the people who had witnessed it? They wouldn't forget. The restaurant may have returned to its usual routine, but the tension still clung to the air, thick and unshakable. Conversations had resumed, but not naturally. There was hesitation, stolen glances, and the occasional whisper as people processed what had just happened. The influencer and his friends were gone, but the impact of their failed spectacle remained, an invisible presence hovering over their abandoned table like the aftermath of a public execution. No one wanted to be the next person to make a fool of themselves. DiCaprio, however, hadn't given it a second thought. He sat back in his chair, his fingers lightly drumming against the table as the waiter returned with the check, placing it down with an almost exaggerated politeness, as if trying to erase any trace of discomfort left in the wake of the confrontation. The waiter hesitated just slightly before speaking, his voice lowered as if unsure whether to acknowledge what had happened. I hope everything was to your liking, sir. DiCaprio slid his card toward him without looking up. It was fine. The waiter hesitated for a fraction of a second too long. That guy, earlier. He's been here before. Likes to cause a scene. DiCaprio finally looked up, his expression unreadable. And the waiter swallowed, shifting his weight slightly. Nothing, sir. Just, most people don't shut him down like that. DiCaprio didn't respond immediately, just studied the waiter with the same measured patience he had used on the fool from earlier. You think I shut him down? The waiter blinked, unsure how to answer. DiCaprio leaned back slightly, exhaling. He shut himself down. The waiter nodded quickly, as if that answer made more sense than he wanted to admit. Without another word, he took the card and disappeared toward the register, leaving DiCaprio to enjoy the last moments of his evening in silence. But silence, as it turned out, wasn't something he would be granted so easily. A presence lingered nearby, just outside the periphery of his vision, hesitant, uncertain. Someone watching him. He turned his head slightly, and there she was, a woman, standing just a few feet away from his table, looking as though she was debating whether she should speak or walk away. She wasn't part of the influencers group, wasn't one of the people who had laughed along earlier. She had been sitting at a table near the back, quiet the entire night, unnoticed until now. He didn't say anything, just raised an eyebrow slightly, waiting. She swallowed, shifting her weight before finally speaking, her voice just loud enough to be heard. I saw what happened. DiCaprio didn't react, but he didn't dismiss her either. She took that as permission to continue. That guy, the one who was mouthing off. He does this a lot. Online, in real life. He picks people, gets under their skin, waits for them to explode so he can turn it into content. DiCaprio's expression remained neutral. He picked the wrong person. She nodded quickly. That's why it's different this time. He was expecting you to fight back, to get mad, to turn it into something he could use. But you didn't. DiCaprio studied her for a moment. And why does that matter to you? She hesitated, as if she wasn't expecting to be asked that. Because I used to be part of that world. I know what happens next. That caught his attention. A flicker of interest passed through his eyes. She glanced toward the entrance, where a few straggling customers were leaving, then back at him. He's not done. Guys like him, they don't take a loss and move on. They rewrite the story to make themselves the victim. You embarrassed him, so now he's going to make sure the internet sees a version where he wins. DiCaprio didn't look surprised, just slightly amused. And she let out a short breath. And I just thought you should know. He took a slow sip of his drink before answering. You think I care? She looked at him for a long moment, then shook her head. No, but he does. DiCaprio smirked slightly, setting his glass down. Then he's already lost. She blinked, caught off guard by how easily he said it, how completely certain he seemed. DiCaprio leaned forward slightly, his voice lower, but firm. You want to know the difference between people like him and people like me? He needs people to react. I don't. The woman swallowed hard, looking as though she was about to say something else, but before she could, the waiter returned with his card. All set, sir. Would you like anything else? DiCaprio took back the card, slipping it into his wallet without looking away from the woman. I'm good. She hesitated one last time, then nodded, stepping back. Guess I just wanted to see for myself. DiCaprio tilted his head slightly. And she exhaled, giving a small, knowing smile. You're exactly who I thought you'd be. With that, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the restaurant crowd. DiCaprio stood, buttoning his jacket as he made his way toward the exit, ignoring the weight of 100 quiet eyes that had been on him all night. By the time he stepped outside, the city lights washed over him, the familiar flash of cameras already waiting at the curb. The world was always watching. But just like in the restaurant, they could only tell the story he allowed them to see. The moment DiCaprio stepped outside, the flashes began. Camera shutters clicked in rapid succession, the artificial lights cutting through the dark like gunfire, each one capturing a version of the story they had already decided to tell. The paparazzi weren't surprised to see him. It was New York, it was a high-profile restaurant, it was just another night where a famous face could be sold for clicks. But this time, there was something else in their eyes, an eagerness, a sharper focus. They had heard something, picked up pieces of what had happened inside, and now they wanted more. Leo, any comment on what happened in there? Did you really shut a guy down for calling you out? Come on, man, did he hit a nerve? DiCaprio didn't slow his pace. His driver had already stepped out, holding the SUV door open, waiting with the same practiced indifference as ever. But before he could reach it, another voice, separate from the others, called out from the side. You think this is over? DiCaprio stopped. Not because the words meant anything to him, but because the voice was familiar. The influencer. He was standing near the sidewalk, just outside the range of the photographers, his face still flushed, but now there was something different in his posture. Less cocky, more controlled. His phone was in his hand, camera pointed right at DiCaprio, streaming or recording, it didn't matter. The game wasn't over yet. He was still trying to win. DiCaprio turned his head slightly, just enough to acknowledge him. The influencer smirked, lifting his phone higher. What? You thought you'd just embarrass me and that'd be it? That I wouldn't say something? That I wouldn't show people what really happened? DiCaprio exhaled through his nose, his patience wearing thin. He took a step closer, not enough to escalate, just enough to close the space between them. His voice was calm, but there was an edge now. What really happened? The influencer grinned wider, energized by the attention, by the cameras now shifting toward him. Yeah, man. You acted like a tough guy in there, like you don't care. But let's be real, you're pissed. You tried to play it cool, but you couldn't handle it, could you? You had to make sure everyone saw you as the guy who put me in my place. He used air quotes, voice dripping with condescension, his confidence returning now that he had the internet watching. DiCaprio let him talk. Let him dig the hole deeper. Then, when the influencer finally stopped, waiting for a reaction, DiCaprio spoke in a tone so quiet that only those closest could hear. You're still here. The influencer blinked, his smirk faltering slightly. What? DiCaprio didn't look at the cameras, didn't acknowledge the crowd. He kept his eyes locked on the man in front of him. You left the restaurant 20 minutes ago, humiliated. You could have gone anywhere. Could have moved on. But you didn't. You waited. His voice didn't rise, didn't waver. You needed another shot. You needed me to care. The influencer opened his mouth, then hesitated. DiCaprio took another step forward, forcing the guy to tilt his head up slightly. And you know the worst part? You didn't even come up with this yourself. You checked your comments, saw people telling you to flip the script, and now you're here, hoping you can turn this into a win. The influencer's grip tightened around his phone, but he forced a laugh, trying to hold onto his act. You think you know me, huh? DiCaprio's expression remained unreadable. I don't need to. For the first time, the influencer glanced around, realizing that the moment wasn't playing out the way he had hoped. The paparazzi weren't laughing with him. The people on the sidewalk weren't supporting him. There was no shift in power, no turning of the tables. He was still exactly where he had been inside, exposed, desperate for relevance. DiCaprio straightened, rolling his shoulders back slightly, his patience nearly gone. I could stand here all night and let you talk. I could let you post whatever you want. But it won't change anything. You'll wake up tomorrow, still chasing moments like this, still hoping someone with a name will acknowledge you, still needing validation from people you'll never meet. The influencer clenched his jaw, but DiCaprio wasn't finished. You think you're making me look bad? He shook his head slightly. No one will remember this tomorrow. Except you. The words landed like a punch. The influencer flinched, just slightly, but enough that anyone paying attention could see it. DiCaprio stepped back, giving him a look that wasn't anger, wasn't mockery, just quiet dismissal. Then, without another word, he turned, stepped into his SUV, and shut the door behind him. The last thing he saw before the car pulled away was the influencer, standing alone on the sidewalk, staring at his phone, unsure whether to hit record again or finally put it away. Inside the SUV, the city lights flickered past in a blur, but DiCaprio barely noticed. He sat in the back seat, phone in hand, scrolling without much focus. He already knew what he'd see. The internet moved fast, and this wasn't going to be an exception. The influencer was going to twist the story, post his version, get his followers to push his narrative. None of it mattered. It would be forgotten in a few days. Maybe sooner. His assistant, sitting in the front passenger seat, turned her head slightly, watching him through the rearview mirror. She had been quiet during the ride, but the way she held her phone told him she was already monitoring the fallout. She exhaled through her nose before speaking. It's spreading. DiCaprio didn't look up. Obviously. She tapped at her screen. Clips from inside the restaurant are everywhere. Someone must have recorded it. Headlines are already coming out. She read one off, her tone flat. Leonardo DiCaprio finally gets confronted about his dating life. His reaction says it all. DiCaprio let out a slow breath, locking his phone and tossing it onto the seat beside him. And what does it say? She scrolled again. Depends on who you ask. Some say you destroyed him. Others say you got defensive. People are picking sides, but it's exactly what you said. He's trying to flip the narrative. He posted a response already. That caught DiCaprio's attention. Already. She nodded. A video. Him talking to the camera, looking all serious. Says he was just asking a question, and that you couldn't handle it. He's trying to play the victim. DiCaprio wasn't surprised. He had seen this play out 1,000 times before, different faces, same tactics. How bad is it? She swiped through the comments. It's mixed. Some people are calling him out for clout chasing, but others are eating it up. He's playing it well, acting like he was the one under attack. DiCaprio glanced out the window, the neon lights reflecting against the glass. Let him. His assistant gave him a look. You really don't care? He turned his gaze back to her, his expression unreadable. Would it change anything if I did? She didn't answer immediately. She knew him well enough to know he wasn't looking for reassurance. Instead, she went back to reading. The good news is, the people who actually matter don't care. Industry people, directors, executives, they've seen it all before. You're not the first actor to get dragged into this kind of thing. DiCaprio leaned his head back against the seat, closing his eyes for a brief moment. And the bad news? She sighed. You know how these things go. It'll snowball for a few days, then something else will happen, and people will move on. But until then, it's going to be everywhere. You'll have people asking about it at events, reporters slipping it into interviews, maybe even late-night hosts making jokes. DiCaprio opened his eyes again, watching the city blur past. They already do. She smirked slightly. True. But now it's fresh. The SUV slowed as they approached his building, the private entrance ensuring he wouldn't have to deal with any lingering press outside. The driver pulled to a stop, stepping out to open the door for him. DiCaprio grabbed his phone, glancing at the notifications that had already flooded in. Texts from people he actually knew. Some checking in, others sending jokes. It was always the same. He pocketed the device and stepped out of the car, his assistant following close behind as they walked toward the elevator. As the doors closed behind them, she finally spoke again. You're not going to respond, are you? He pressed the button for his floor, his tone final. No. She nodded, as if she had expected that. Then let's hope he burns himself out. DiCaprio didn't reply. He didn't need to. The elevator doors opened, and without another word, he stepped inside, leaving the noise of the world behind him. DiCaprio stepped into his penthouse, locking the door behind him as the silence wrapped around him. It was the kind of quiet most people would find unsettling, but to him, it was normal. No flashing cameras, no whispered conversations, no lingering stares. Just stillness. He walked through the dimly lit space, dropping his phone onto the kitchen counter without checking it again. He already knew what was waiting: messages, Headlines, notifications stacking up like a digital storm. But he wasn't going to give it his attention. Not tonight. He loosened the cuffs of his sleeves, rolling them up as he poured himself a drink, something smooth, something familiar. As he sat down on the couch, he exhaled slowly, letting his mind go blank for the first time all night. But the moment didn't last. His phone vibrated against the counter, not a notification, but a call. He glanced at the screen. A name he hadn't expected. He let it ring twice before picking up. Yeah. A familiar voice came through the line, casual but edged with curiosity. So, you went viral again. DiCaprio smirked slightly, shaking his head. Seems like it. You plan on doing anything about it? No. The voice on the other end chuckled. Of course not. A pause. But you know it's not just noise, right? This guy's milking it for everything he can. He's pushing harder than you probably expected. DiCaprio took a slow sip of his drink, unfazed. Let him. You sure? He's not just some random nobody. He's got reach. He's calling you out directly now, saying you tried to silence him, that you couldn't handle criticism. He's going on podcasts, doing interviews. People are listening. DiCaprio leaned back, stretching his legs out in front of him. People listen to whatever's loudest. Doesn't mean they care. There was another pause, this time longer. You ever wonder if you should say something? Just once. DiCaprio let out a quiet breath. And give him exactly what he wants? Maybe. Or maybe you set the record straight before it gets worse. DiCaprio rolled his neck, feeling the weight of the day settle into his shoulders. If I respond, he wins. If I ignore him, he burns out. He glanced toward his phone screen, a new headline flashing across it. He didn't read it. He won't last. None of them do. The voice on the other end sighed. All right. Your call. DiCaprio smirked. Always is. The call ended. He set his phone down again, rubbing his temples. This wasn't new. It never was. He had spent years watching people try to use his name for relevance, twisting narratives, stirring controversy, all for a moment in the spotlight. But attention was fleeting and desperation was loud. He had learned a long time ago that the best way to handle people like that was to let them run themselves into the ground. The phone vibrated again, this time with a text from his assistant. He's doing a live stream. He's pushing harder. He's trying to bait you. DiCaprio didn't respond. Instead, he stood up, walked to the window, and looked out over the city. The world was still moving, cars weaving through the streets below, people living their lives without a second thought about the headlines that were taking over social media. It was a reminder that no matter how big the moment felt, it was just that, a moment. It would pass. It always did. Another vibration. Another message. You're trending at #1. He exhaled slowly, watching the lights below. The internet was a machine, constantly hungry, constantly churning. Right now, it was focused on him. Tomorrow, it would be someone else. He turned away from the window, grabbed his phone, and placed it face down on the counter. Then, without a second thought, he walked to his bedroom, shutting the door behind him. The world would keep talking. But by morning, it would be on to something else. It always was.